No television show in American history carried the same rhythm, the same cultural heartbeat as Soul Train. For 35 years, it wasn't just a music program, it was a stage where style, identity, and an entire generation of sound came alive. Yet in 2006, the train screeched to a halt. No farewell tour, no final parade, just silence. And at the center of that silence lies one story, a story whispered about for years. The infamous scene that took Soul Train off air for good. To understand how one moment could end a cultural institution, we need to go back to the beginning, to the life of the man who built the train and the legacy that rolled across America. Don Cornelius was born in 1936 on the south side of Chicago. His early life unfolded against the backdrop of an America still defined by segregation. Before he ever stood under studio lights, Cornelius worked a series of ordinary jobs, traffic officer, insurance salesman, until one bold decision shifted his destiny. In 1966, he enrolled in a short-term broadcasting course. Within months, he was reporting the news at WCIU-TV, a small but ambitious Chicago station. It was there that he dreamed of something revolutionary, a program dedicated to the Black community, a televised celebration of music, dance, and cultural pride. On August 17, 1970, the first local broadcast of Soul Train hit the airwaves. It was raw, energetic, and instantly magnetic. Within a year, it wasn't just Chicago's secret. On October 2, 1971, with sponsorship from Sears and Johnson Products, Soul Train went national. What began as a shoestring production became a phenomenon. Suddenly, America was invited to witness James Brown, Aretha Franklin, Marvin Gaye, Michael Jackson, and later Mary J. Blige and LL Cool J, all on one stage. But the show wasn't only about music, it was about the dancers. The Soul Train line, 2 rows, 1 aisle, and endless creativity became a weekly ritual, a living catwalk of fashion and individuality. Rosie Perez, Jody Watley, Jeffrey Daniel all cut their teeth here before moving on to stardom. Daniel would even teach Michael Jackson the moonwalk, a move born on Soul Train's floor. For millions of viewers, Saturday afternoons meant the same thing, tuning in to see themselves reflected with pride. Don Cornelius wasn't just a host, he was a visionary. Calm, refined, with a voice like velvet, he carried an aura that made Soul Train unlike anything else on television. Cornelius believed TV wasn't a privilege for one group. It was a platform where all cultures deserved a seat. And in the 1970s, that idea was radical. At its height, Soul Train was pulling ratings between 4.5 and 5.0. It was the longest-running music show of its time. Brands lined up to advertise, awards ceremonies spun off, merchandise flew off shelves. Life magazine even named Don Cornelius one of America's 100 most important people in 1971. But even icons have shadows. And behind the glamour, conflicts were brewing. Cornelius was known as a perfectionist, almost militant about control. Dancers weren't paid, yet were expected to follow strict rules on choreography, appearance, even fashion choices. Rosie Perez recalled being told to tone down her moves when Cornelius felt they didn't align with his artistic vision. To him, Soul Train wasn't just entertainment, it was an image, one he guarded fiercely. Then came the music wars. By the late 1980s, hip-hop was rising, but Cornelius resisted. To him, the language, aggression, and themes didn't represent the positivity he wanted associated with Soul Train. In 1992, he said bluntly, "I don't want my show overtaken by sounds that don't represent anything positive." It was a controversial stance. Young audiences flocked to Yo! MTV Raps and Rap City. Artists like Tupac, Nas, and Snoop Dogg rarely, if ever, graced the Soul Train stage. Viewership began to slip. By the 2000s, ratings had sunk below 2.0. In 1993, Cornelius stepped down as host. The baton passed to Maestro Clark, Shamar Moore, and Dorian Gregory. They brought energy, but none could replicate the gravitas of Cornelius. The set changed, the music shifted, but the magic felt diluted. By the early 2000s, production was shrinking. Budgets were cut. Key staff left. Episodes per season dropped. Affiliates started replacing the once sacred time slot with fresher, trendier programming. And then came 2006, the final year. On the surface, it was just another season. But behind closed doors, the train was rattling off its tracks. Production crews reshuffled. Don Cornelius, though officially retired from daily duties, still lingered like a watchful ghost backstage. And then came the day of the taping, the day of the scene. It was supposed to be a routine episode in Los Angeles. A rising hip-hop artist was scheduled to perform. Yet from the beginning, chaos filled the air. The guest list was disorganized. The show started late. Representatives clashed with producers. The energy felt wrong. And when the artist finally took the stage, everything changed. The performance broke every unspoken rule that had once defined Soul Train. Costumes and choreography clashed with the clean image Cornelius had fought to protect. Visuals shocked the older crew members. Former editors would later call it a line that should never have been crossed. Backstage, Cornelius reportedly ordered the editing process to stop immediately. He called for an emergency meeting with distributors. Tribune Entertainment, one of the show's biggest backers, withdrew within weeks. And in less than a month, nearly half of Soul Train's affiliates had dropped the program. No announcement, no farewell. The infamous scene was never aired, but in whispers, in staff recollections, it became the reason Soul Train died. The train had stopped. But was it really just one scene? Or had the cracks been forming for years? In the next part, we'll dig deeper into what insiders called the cursed performance, the backlash that never made the headlines, and the hidden fractures that left Don Cornelius haunted until the end. To understand why that final taping in 2006 spiraled into infamy, we have to pull back the curtain and look at the slow unraveling that had been happening for years. For much of the 1970s and 1980s, Soul Train was untouchable. It was where stars were made, where style was born, where culture wasn't just performed, it was defined. But longevity brings pressure, and pressure cracks foundations. Don Cornelius had always been seen as a strict operator. He didn't just run the show, he was the show. From the angles of the cameras to the hemline of a dancer's dress, Cornelius approved it all. To some, his control gave the show its unique polish. To others, it stifled creativity. Former dancers would later speak candidly about the experience. They weren't paid. They weren't given contracts. Their only reward was national exposure. For a handful like Rosie Perez, who would later choreograph for Janet Jackson and star in major films, the exposure worked. But for many others, it felt exploitative. Their youth, energy, and artistry fed the brand, while they walked away with nothing more than a memory. Yet the deeper fracture came with music itself. When hip-hop surged in the late 1980s, Cornelius's resistance put him at odds with the very audience he once courted. For years, he had embraced funk, soul, R&B, disco, genres rooted in celebration and groove. But rap, with its raw edge, troubled him. He saw it as a reflection of violence, poverty, and division. He worried it reinforced stereotypes rather than broke them down. In a 1992 interview, Cornelius was blunt. "I don't want my show overtaken by sounds that don't represent anything positive." That one statement echoed like a warning bell. The younger generation wasn't turning away from rap, they were running toward it. Beats Rap City exploded. MTV found new lifeblood in Yo MTV Raps. And while Tupac, Biggie, and Nas defined an era, Soul Train felt increasingly like yesterday's news. By the early 2000s, the gap was undeniable. Ratings had slid to below 2.0. Advertisers pulled back. Affiliates, once clamoring to carry the program, now questioned whether it could still compete. And the hardest truth? Even inside the studio, energy was fading. Longtime editors resigned. Camera operators moved on. The production team became a revolving door. For a show built on consistency, the instability was poison. Meanwhile, Don Cornelius himself was retreating. Though he had officially stepped down in 1993, his shadow loomed over every decision. He rarely gave interviews, rarely appeared at public events. Insiders described him as disillusioned, even bitter. He believed the program he built was losing its soul, that new producers no longer understood what Soul Train was meant to represent. This tension created a powder keg, and in 2006, that keg finally ignited. The Wari episode in question was taped in Los Angeles, like countless before it. On paper, it was routine. A rising hip-hop artist, dancers, cameras, lights. But something about that day was different. The guest list wasn't finalized until the last minute. Logistics broke down. Crew members whispered that the director's chair felt empty, that no one was steering the ship. And though Cornelius had no formal role, several staff members later swore they saw him backstage, pacing, frustrated, watching a legacy he no longer recognized. When the artist finally took the stage, the performance shocked nearly everyone in the room. The choreography was provocative, the costumes revealing, the lyrics unfiltered. To an audience used to MTV, it might have been nothing unusual. But to Soul Train, it was an earthquake. Longtime editors recalled shaking their heads. One described it as a violation of the DNA of the show. For 35 years, Cornelius had drawn invisible boundaries around what Soul Train could be. That day, every boundary was broken in a single performance. What happened next remains murky. Some accounts say Cornelius demanded the cameras be shut off mid-performance. Others say the full show was taped, but he personally ordered that no editing be done afterward. What is certain is this. Within days, an emergency meeting was held with Tribune Entertainment, one of the program's largest distributors. The verdict? Tribune pulled out. For Soul Train, that was the kiss of death. No distributor, no network, no affiliates. Within 3 weeks, more than 40% of stations had dropped the show. By the end of the season, the schedule was gone, the staff dismissed, and the show that had run since 1971 was over. But why did this particular performance trigger such a catastrophic response? Was it really about choreography, costumes, or was the infamous scene simply the final straw in a long, slow decline? In Part 3, we'll uncover the rumors about what was actually seen that day, the so-called cursed footage, and why it has never to this day been released to the public. When fans speak of the infamous scene, they almost whisper, because unlike the thousands of Soul Train episodes that lit up American living rooms, this one never aired. No VHS recording ever made it into circulation, no rerun, no YouTube upload. What remains are fragments, recollections from crew members, rumors passed between former dancers, and scattered notes from industry insiders. So what really happened during that final taping in 2006? The performance, by all accounts, was unlike anything Soul Train had ever staged. The artist, whose name remains redacted in most insider accounts, was a rising figure in the hip-hop world. His team arrived with an entourage larger than the production crew itself. Negotiations about set design and timing delayed the taping by nearly an hour. By the time cameras rolled, tensions were already high. Then came the showstopper. Dancers stormed the stage in costumes far more provocative than Soul Train audiences were used to seeing. The choreography, sharp and suggestive, broke away from the smooth grooves that had defined the line for decades. Lyrics poured out raw and unfiltered, tackling themes of violence and street culture that Cornelius had once vowed would never define his stage. For the younger crew, perhaps it felt like nothing unusual. After all, MTV and BET had been showcasing similar performances for years. But for the veterans, those who had spent their lives curating Soul Train's cleaner image, it was a shockwave. One staff editor, speaking anonymously in a later interview, recalled, "It was like someone hijacked the train. Everything Don spent years building, the positivity, the pride, the balance was just thrown off the rails in a single number." The fallout began immediately. Backstage, Cornelius was reportedly furious. Though retired, he demanded the footage be locked down. An emergency production halt was called. Dancers and crew members were sent home with no explanation. Insiders would later claim that Cornelius stormed into a conference room and refused to let the editing process begin. Within a week, Tribune Entertainment, already uneasy about dwindling ratings, announced it was pulling out as distributor. That decision triggered a domino effect. Local affiliates, sensing instability, began dropping the show. By April 2006, more than 40% of Soul Train's time slots had been replaced with syndicated programming. The infamous scene never reached audiences, but the legend of it grew larger with every year that followed. Fans online began referring to it as the cursed performance. the taping that ended the longest-running music show in television history. Why cursed? Because those who had been there described a strange aftermath. Longtime staff who had poured decades into the show suddenly found themselves jobless overnight. Former dancers spoke of a sadness that lingered. Even Don Cornelius himself seemed unable to recover from the fallout. Rosie Perez, who once danced on the program, called the show's sudden end an unnamed sadness. Host Dorian Gregory admitted that most of the cast had no idea the show was over until the internal taping schedule simply vanished from the system. No memo, no meeting, just silence. The more details leaked, the more the mystery deepened. Some claim the unaired footage included explicit gestures that made advertisers panic. Others insisted it wasn't about the performance itself, but about the behind-the-scenes fights it triggered. A faction of producers wanted to modernize aggressively. Cornelius wanted to preserve tradition. The clash, many believe, was irreconcilable, and the episode became the flashpoint. For fans, the greatest frustration has been the secrecy. Why, after decades of celebration, would the end of Soul Train be buried so completely? Industry insiders point to legal entanglements. The artist's Seguro management team reportedly filed restrictions on distribution. Tribune, wary of backlash, washed its hands clean, and Cornelius, heartbroken, withdrew from public commentary. To this day, the footage exists, locked away in private archives of former staff and possibly in the vaults of production companies. Yet none have dared release it, not even in documentaries or retrospectives. And so, the legend only grows. Meanwhile, Soul Train's earlier years began experiencing a digital rebirth. Old VHS recordings were uploaded to YouTube. Clips of the Soul Train line went viral, drawing millions of views from younger audiences who had never known the show firsthand. Costume recreations, dance challenges, and fan pages turned the program into a cultural time capsule. But the infamous scene, it remained a black hole in the show's history, a missing piece too heavy to air. In Part 4, we'll follow what happened to Don Cornelius in the aftermath, how the man who built the train carried the weight of its collapse, and why the final years of his life remain as mysterious and haunting as the episode itself. When the cameras shut down in 2006, it wasn't just the end of a television show, it was the silencing of a cultural institution. And no one felt that silence more heavily than Don Cornelius. For decades, he had been the conductor, the steady voice reminding viewers week after week, "You can bet your last money it's all going to be a stone gas, honey." But after that final taping, the one buried forever, Cornelius never spoke about Soul Train with the same pride again. In the months that followed, he refused interviews. When pressed by radio hosts in 2007, he gave only a brief, cryptic statement. "I think it went far enough." To fans, it sounded like resignation. To insiders, it sounded like heartbreak. Behind the scenes, his absence was glaring. The man who once controlled every detail of the show had retreated into near-total privacy. Some staff believed he felt betrayed, not only by the networks and distributors that abandoned the program, but by the shift in culture itself. Hip-hop, once the sound he resisted, had fully taken over the mainstream. BET, MTV, and later VH1 dominated the music television landscape. Soul Train, once the pioneer, had become the relic. For Cornelius, that reality was devastating. He had built a program to showcase Black culture with dignity and artistry. To see it end not with applause but with scandal, cut deeper than ratings ever could. The years after 2006 only deepened the sense of tragedy. In 2008, Cornelius was arrested on charges of domestic violence. Though he avoided jail, the incident stained his once sterling reputation. Friends described him as a man struggling with isolation, haunted by the past. The show that had defined his life was gone, and the legacy he had worked so hard to protect felt fractured. By 2012, the story took its darkest turn. Cornelius passed away at his Los Angeles home under tragic circumstances. The news shocked not only the entertainment world, but generations of fans who had grown up with his voice in their living rooms. In his passing, questions resurfaced. Had the infamous scene and the collapse of Soul Train contributed to his despair? Was the weight of that unfinished legacy too heavy to carry? In the aftermath, media outlets began piecing together the story. The Los Angeles Times described him as a trailblazer who exited in the quietest way possible. Vibe magazine called the show's cancellation not a ratings failure, but a collapse of trust within the production itself. To this day, many believe the internal disputes triggered by the 2006 performance were the final straw. Meanwhile, the Soul Train Awards, launched in 1987 as a sister brand, continued, but without Cornelius at the helm. By 2009, BET had taken full control, revamping the awards into a more modern spectacle. While popular, the awards rarely reference the golden years, leaving many longtime viewers with the sense that a cornerstone of pop culture had been erased without explanation. But fans refused to let the memory die. Online, the archives of Soul Train flourished. VHS tapes turned into digital uploads. YouTube channels dedicated to the Soul Train line racked up millions of views. New generations discovered the show, mimicked the dances, and recreated the fashions. And yet the story always circled back to that missing piece: the 2006 taping, the cursed performance, the unaired footage. Some called it the Soul Train Curse, a symbolic phrase for the unease that hung over everyone connected to the program. For those who were there, the emotional toll was heavy. Dancers recalled the abrupt end with sadness. Editors remembered walking away mid-project, their work unfinished. Even hosts like Dorian Gregory admitted they didn't know the show had ended until the schedules disappeared. The silence was worse than any official cancellation. What remains today is a fractured legacy. On one hand, Soul Train is celebrated in museums, documentaries, and cultural panels. On the other, its ending is treated like a wound that never fully healed. The light it brought to millions of homes is unquestionable, but the darkness that followed is harder to forget. Nearly 2 decades after the train stopped running, Soul Train remains both a celebration and a mystery. The unaired 2006 episode, whispered about as the cursed performance, is the blank page in an otherwise overflowing scrapbook of American pop culture. Its absence has made it even more powerful. Fans often ask, why not release it? Why not let the public decide whether the performance was truly out of bounds? But the reality is more complicated. Legal restrictions, distribution fallout, and the personal wishes of Don Cornelius all combined to bury the footage. Some insiders suggest that to release it now would dishonor his legacy, that it would reduce a decades-long cultural treasure to a scandal. Others argue that transparency is the only way to fully close the chapter. For now, the tape remains sealed and the silence continues. Yet while the infamous scene is hidden, the rest of Soul Train's story has been reborn. YouTube has become a digital archive where the Soul Train line lives on in millions of replays. New generations, children born long after the show ended, discover the joy of those Saturday afternoons. They mimic the dances, recreate the fashions, even host costume competitions themed after the 1970s. In 2021, the viral hashtag Soul Train Challenge spread across TikTok and Instagram, with young artists from Lizzo to Anderson, .Pac joining the movement. The rhythms Cornelius curated still echo, proving the train never truly stopped. It just found new tracks. Academics and cultural historians now argue that Soul Train deserves to be preserved as a national treasure, alongside Motown records and the civil rights anthems of the 1960s. The Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture holds original costumes and artifacts. Documentaries like American Soul dramatize Cornelius's journey, showing a new generation the struggles behind the glamour. Exhibitions across the country remind audiences that Soul Train was never just television. It was representation. It was power. It was joy. And yet the question always lingers. What really happened in that final taping? Was it just one performance that went too far? Or was it the inevitable breaking point of years of decline, disagreements, and cultural shifts? Perhaps the truth is both. Perhaps the infamous scene wasn't the sole reason the train stopped, but the spark that ignited an already fragile structure. For Don Cornelius, it was the moment his vision no longer matched the reality of the industry. For networks, it was the excuse to cut ties. For fans, it became the symbol of an ending no one saw coming. The irony is that what was hidden has now become unforgettable, because history often remembers not the polished finales, but the unresolved endings. The unaired episode, the one no one was allowed to see, has become the most enduring story of Soul Train. When viewers look back now, they don't just remember the music or the fashion. They remember a space where, for the first time, Black culture was celebrated on national television without compromise. They remember the line of dancers, the sparkle of sequins, the velvet voice of Cornelius closing the show. They remember believing that Saturday afternoons were theirs. And maybe that is why the mystery endures. Because the silence of 2006 couldn't erase the sound of 3.5 decades. Because sometimes what never airs speaks louder than what does. If you've ever watched Soul Train, or even if you're just discovering it now, share your memories below. Which moment from the show stays with you the most? And what do you think about the infamous episode that ended it all? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us again as we continue uncovering the hidden stories behind television's greatest legends.